We got hit from 4 sides all at once, deafening.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
The only thing I was scared of was failing, was letting down the people there that I was supposed to support.
Things went south really bad.
You've got to have an element of crazy to be good at what we do.
There was an ego attached to being a gunfighter. I've been shot.
Being around big, tall trees, thick shrubbery, potentially connects him to other moments in his life during battle.
It's not easy.
Walking in minefield, not knowing when your legs were going to get blown off.
You know, we're a part of this
The
fight.
story of transformation is powerful.
Welcome to the second part of my conversation with former Commando Dean Parkinson. Volume 1 covered Dean's earlier years in and out of uniform and finished with joining the 2nd Commando Regiment and deploying to Afghanistan in 2009. This episode picks up right after that combat deployment, with sights set for another tour in 2010. So Dean, tell me, as the tour progresses and eventually comes to a conclusion, are you feeling content and satisfied that you finally got to have these experiences? And then how do you find that mental transition coming from that kinetic, high-intensity deployment to being home and back with the family?
I think, had I just spent my whole trip in mortar platoon, I would have been really disappointed, I think. And that's not to reflect on the importance of mortar platoon and the guys that were in there, because they'd already done that, right? So these are guys who are already kicking indoors and stuff, and then they've gone to mortar platoon as a part of their progression in the battalion, I suppose, or the regiment. But yeah, so once I actually got that fight in the green belt, I went back and I remember talking to the guys that I used to be in the platoon with, and they were saying lots of people go for years and years and years without getting that. You've got it on your first trip. I was really excited about that. And I know people might think that's weird, but I was so happy that had happened. And my analogy with it is, it's like when you parachute, right? I know guys who have had 5,000 parachute jumps and they've never had a malfunction. So they still don't feel like they're a real skydiver or parachutist. They still don't feel like they've made sure that they can deal with any situation until they've had a malfunction. And I think it's the same thing with the gunfight thing, you know, like I think until you've actually had that and you've proved to yourself more than anything that you can perform the job, then I think you always have that little thing in the back of your mind, you know, sort of hoping and wishing that it would happen. I was never afraid to die, mate. And I don't mean that in a gung-ho way. I certainly don't mean that in a real rough, tough way. And I don't want to sound like a wanker, but I was never, ever afraid to die. The first thing that I didn't want to be responsible for was the death of a friend of mine or a colleague. The second thing was I didn't want to be responsible for the wounding or of mate getting injured. The third thing was I didn't want to be responsible for killing or wounding a civilian. That didn't need to be. Then I went down to the fourth thing, which I didn't want to lose my appendage. Didn't want to lose my tackle or the wheels, so to speak. I could deal with, you know, losing an arm or a leg or something like that, but I certainly didn't want to lose that.
There are more important things to lose, yeah.
The ability to go home and have fun, even without a leg or an arm, I'm sure, is so important, you know, and I say that with the utmost respect to friends of mine and that who have suffered that.
I'm sure that's all very important to Julie as well.
Yes, exactly. Anyway, the last thing was sort of getting killed myself. And that's where it was. It was like 5th or 6th down the run. I never even thought about it. I can honestly say I never did a job and I thought about getting killed. Were we in situations where I thought I could get killed? Absolutely. Heaps of them, right? But in the heat of the moment, all you're doing is you're doing your job. So you're micromanaging. You're focusing on your job to start with. Then you're focusing on the team, and then you're focusing on mission success and focus outside of that. So it's almost like, once again, with skydiving, we have a thing called sensory overload. You know, when you first start skydiving, you've got this small little 5-cent piece thing that you're concentrating on. That is jumping out and pulling a handle. And as you get thousands and thousands of jumps up and more experience, that expands to out here, where you could be a tandem master with a camera on your wrist, jumping out of a plane with a person on the front of you, worried about where the sun is, where the light is, and worried, are they smiling on the front? How's their body position? Where, you know, all that sort of stuff. The same thing I think happens with the more time you spend in combat, that awareness level grows. When I finished that trip, I was really happy at the end of that trip. I just wanted to come back again as soon as I could. I found it okay to go home because I really miss my family and that. But when you're over there, I mean, we Skyped and we talked and everything. But as soon as you went outside the war and you went on a job, then I didn't think about them at all. I have to say, the one time I did on that trip, and that was when we were actually in a long-range contact at the time, and I got called over to the boss's car, and my wife had a miscarriage while I was away, and she was a fair way through the pregnancy, and they did offer to fly me home, which would have been a mission coming from where we were. Like, it would have been helicopter to car, the helicopter to get me back to TK or whatever, and then fly home. And look, I decided not to, because my focus was on the team and the job. I reconciled that with my wife when I come home, and she understood, because there was nothing that I was going to be able to do besides obviously comforting her and that, because it was a very heavy situation for her, and I have the utmost respect for my wife, because war is a lot harder on the people at home than I think it is than on the guys there. Yeah, sure, when you're there, it's tough, it's hard work and everything, but we all want to be there. When you're at home and they hear things on the TV or the news and stuff, and even though they know that they're going to get a phone call first, the worry that they must go through and the stress, which is probably what caused my wife to have a miscarriage at that time, I think they're the ones that should be getting medals and, you know, getting Best Soldier awards. I think it's my wife that should get that. I chose the team and the job first over that, going home. I'm still okay with that decision these days. When I actually went home, I had time to reconcile with my wife and, you know, hang out with my kids. And it was a bit funny. Like, it was fine with the, don't get me wrong, it was all good. You know, we had barbecues with my friends, my triathlete mates and stuff, and they all looked after my family while I was away. And we'd have barbecues and talk and stuff like that. But at the same time, all I was really focused on was, like, we had 4 or 6 weeks leave when I got home, and then you go straight back in and do courses, and we did build-up training. So I got marched straight out of Bravo Company. They were going on to TAG. And then I went straight over to Alpha Company to rotate back in 2010. And I was so happy about that.
Well, Dean, let's get right into it. Tell me about your 2010 deployment, and how are you finding being in contact situations after this, like you just described? Is that awareness of being in combat zooming out from that micro focus to that macro focus? Are you feeling, I don't mean this in a wanky way, but a greater sense of mastery of what you're doing and the skills involved, and you're a better cog in the machine? You're contributing more strongly as a team member.
Yes, I did feel like that. Like, once again, I still had this thing. I mean, I think I've always had it. I've always had a little bit of an inferior complex about myself. I've never really thought that I was a super soldier or anything like that. I don't think any of the guys in the unit do think they're super soldiers, but I never thought I was always super on top of it. However, when I got to go and I joined Alpha Company and I met the new guys in my team, and I was going to be team scout, which is what I always wanted to do. Because, I mean, if there's one thing that I was good at, was seeing things. I got to start so many contacts over there because I actually saw it, the dude or position or whatever. I saw it before it happened. I just had good eyes. I don't know why. I just did, you know. And my hearing mightn't have been the best, but my eyes were pretty good, you know. So when I joined the team in Alpha Company, I was extremely excited. We did a lot of really good lead-up training. We did marksmanship courses and stuff like that. I was going to be doing a sniper course at the end of my 2010 trip. Like, I was just so happy to be there. And with the lead-up that we had, I did feel like I was contributing a lot more. On the lead-up training that we did in Koltana, only a few weeks before we actually pushed out to Afghanistan, we go down to there and we do a lot of live fire, room-to-room combat, live fire, cars, the whole lot, helo operations, everything. A guy that I didn't know extremely well, but I'd met him a few times. He was in the other platoon. His name's Mason Edwards. He was killed in training. Now, that was horrific. When that happened, put a stop on everything, only for about 24 hours, and then it was work as normal because we were still building up to go overseas. That happened, and Mason, I have to say, gets left out of the conversation, you know, 42 for 42. It's actually 43, you know, because even though he died on a training operation, it was during the decade of conflict, and I really believe that he should be included in that. When that happened, that really brings home to you how real training is. I mean, training is as real as it gets, and then you go over and you do the job, and it has to be like that. I don't know the exact details of that night. I never really wanted to find out, but he was shot through a soft wall. I think their team stacked up on the wrong wall or something. And I know there's people out there that will know a lot more than me, so that's all I want to say on it. It was a tragic event. And I know that that really brought it home to the families of guys too before he went away, because we actually went back home to Queensland for his funeral before we flew back to Afghanistan to start our tour in 2010. So seeing the family then for a very short period of time, I had one night, I think, maybe with the family, the boys and that. So my wife and the 2 boys came to the funeral. The 2 boys were really young then. So I think they were like 2 and 4 or something, or 3 and 5. Anyway, and so I got to spend a night with them. And then, we went over to Afghanistan. When we went into country, basically all helo ops then pretty much. The first trip was basically a lot of driving around in cars. That trip was just amazing, you know. Being an assaulter in a team straight away, I was really happy about that, and I had a really good team. The 2IC of my team at that time, who's a really good mate of mine, he's still, I think he just got out, but he's working overseas somewhere. He and I are like chalk and cheese. We clash heads a little bit, but he had a family as well. We used to talk about, his girls and my boys and stuff like that. And he was a great, great guy, and I've got utmost respect for him. He was the 2IC for my team, but then ended up becoming the team commander when our team was depleted from 6 guys to 4 guys by the end of this trip, because we had a pretty high attrition rate of guys getting wounded and killed on that operation.
And we will get to some of those tragic losses. First, let's talk about one particularly memorable engagement you're in this tour.
The Battle for Schwalikot. It was a 5-day operation. So Major General John Campbell described it as, the biggest operation gunfight that Australian forces, especially Australian Special Forces, had been in since the Vietnam War. So, and I mean, that, as you know, involved SASR and 2 Commando. But we went out, we were doing shaping operations in the lead up to this, and we got into plenty of gunfights and stuff in the lead up to this. And we were sort of just shaping the battlefield for that battlefield space for going into this stronghold called Schwalikot and basically taking the fight to the enemy. So they put in the commando unit on the first day. We went in late at night. I think we landed like midnight or something like that, or maybe 1 a.m, and then started kicking doors in and getting guys out of bed and asking questions. And we sort of were coming up pretty dry. We knew that these guys were the guys we were after, but they had no weapons in their houses and we couldn't find anything. So we did this all the way till the early hours of the morning, till about, I think it was like 5 a.m. in the morning. We were still going into different compounds, trying to find out where the bad guys were. We were getting some ICOM chatter and stuff like that. And then the Sierras were up on one of the features. Our Sierra team was up on one of the features and they contacted and killed 2 guys at about 5:30 in the morning. And then that started it off. The rest of the day was gunfighting the whole day. There were skirmishes. We were all split up into, I think we were about 3 or 4 different elements. Our team was tasked to get up onto the high ground with the Sierras that had that early morning contact and go and give them support. They were also up there with very little water or anything. They didn't have anything. It was a super hot day. It was becoming a super hot day. So we were tasked to go up onto the top of the ridgeline with those guys up to the top of the mountain. We made our way up there. All the while, the other elements were in pretty heavy gunfights, surrounded most of the day. We made our way up to the top, and then we were basically in the Sierra role with those guys, just helping spot and shoot and share the workload for the day. Now, this is the top of a feature. This is the highest feature up there. There was an IED that they'd already found up there, so we put a marker panel over it. So there was an IED there. So this is obviously where the bad guys, this was their high ground that they wanted. There were a couple of other features that were a little bit lower, but 500 to 800 metres away sort of thing, or 400 to 800 metres away, depending on which feature it was. And the other elements were down in the green belt. Everyone was having their own problems and gunfights during the whole day. So we're pretty much stuck up there. It was extremely hot. There was no shade. And we'd been going for around about mid-morning to lunchtime, maybe 10 o'clock to midday. And we'd sort of just had time to, okay, like if one guy at a time could sort of have a bit of a rest, it wasn't like you were going to sleep, but you could just sort of, take your gear off for a sec, have a drink, try and get under a little bit of shade on the corner of a rock in between sort of gunfire. And it's while we were up there, there was a lull for about an hour and a half, nothing happening. Like we were seeing guys, well, it was actually females with their full hijabs on, that you could see that they were resupping. They were sort of walking out of the green belt with stuff under there and resupping whoever was up in the mountains, okay? So that sort of pattern of life stuff was going on while we were having a bit of a rest. We got hit from 4 sides all at once, deafening, defilade fire from down below, PKM fire, RPGs, you name it, was coming in from every direction. So you couldn't hide behind a rock because you were getting rocks smashing with rounds from this side, and then wasps, the sounds of wasps, those really close ones coming past you directly this way. It didn't matter which way you went. You just had to sort of sit there and take it. So this was then a long-range gun battle that went all afternoon, and we were spotting and acquiring targets and killing enemy. RPGs were coming up these ridge lines. They would come up in between us and the other part of the team that was sitting maybe 3 or 4 metres. I remember seeing, they must have been 1,000 metres as the sort of the reach for an RPG. And they must have been coming up to the end of it because one RPG came up in between us, and we had a bear up there, which is a guy who's listening in for us, and he had his interpreter with him. This RPG slammed into the rock just behind him and didn't go off. And this was like 2 or 3 metres from me, and I've got a great pic of this mate of mine holding up this RPG rocket that didn't go off. And if it had gone off, it would have killed him and the interpreter that we had with us. This went on for a good half an hour. It was really intense fighting. And then it sort of mellowed out into the afternoon. It was a bit of a snipe off, really, I suppose, for want of better words. There's still heavy fighting going on all day in the Greenbelt. But late that afternoon, I paired up with another mate of mine who's still in, and a guy who I really looked up to as well, Ben Chuck. He used to be later killed in action in the same helicopter crash as the other boys. But he was a really good sniper, and he was glassing for me. He gave me his SR-25 and said, right, let's go. I'm going to call you on and you can fire and get some practice, because when we get home from this, you're doing a sniper course with us. And I was like, yep, cool. All afternoon, we basically did that. And we were clocking dozens and dozens of enemy here. And we were trying to call in air support. While this was all happening, and this is all in hindsight that I know this from talking to the other elements down in the Greenbelt, they were surrounded as well and in really heavy gunfights all day. Our OC and CSN were trying to call in air support, but we were getting no love from TK. They weren't allowing us to call in any air support. But we could have killed dozens more. I think we killed about 24 guys that day, the whole element, all of us together. And we probably could have killed another 24. In the late afternoon, when the Taliban fighters started pouring back out of the Greenbelt, we were up high, we were glassing, and we could see them. They were a bit out of range, so we couldn't really shoot them. We were trying to call in Apaches to come in and strafe these guys, but they wouldn't do it. All they would let us have late afternoon was to drop a 500-pound bomb on this peak that was about 400 metres away that we were trying to get this other sniper, or a Taliban sniper team or whatever you want to call them. We were trying to get these guys all day. And there's a funny little story I'll tell you about in a minute. But we got to drop a 500-pounder on these guys late in the afternoon, and that sort of silenced them finally. And that sort of led into a pretty quiet night. Late afternoon, we were glassing across this other peak about 400 metres away. I remember sitting there looking through my SR-25 scope, Schmidt & Better scope I had there. And I remember looking across trying to find where this guy was coming from. And a really good mate of mine who's still in at the moment, he's glassing as well at the same time. And I'm looking and I go, because there's still shots coming. There's still shots coming, really quite accurate shots, pinging and rocks in front of you and all sorts of stuff. It was pretty heavy still. I just sort of said to him, I said, do you reckon this see you later can see us? And no sooner had that come out of my mouth and a wasp of a round went straight past my head. Like it's the one that you don't hear that gets you. And this thing was so close. And then there was one followed up straight away. Boom, boom, just the 2 wasps. I had my camera going on my helmet, on my hat, and you can hear this wasp, like super close. And no sooner had I said, hey, do you reckon this see you later can see us? That happened. True to form, very dry. My mate who was sitting beside me didn't even pull his eye away from the glass. He goes, I reckon that see you later can see ya. And we just pissed ourselves laughing so hard. It was such a great moment after such a heavy day. And it was a really heavy day of fighting. We didn't lose anyone, which is a miracle, I reckon. And that comes into the story later on with Timmy Applin again. But we didn't lose anyone. Nothing happened. The very next day is when the SASR guys, only a couple of Ks away, just over the next valley, heloed in and had that big action that they were involved with while we were still fighting in the other valley. They had that really big action there where RS earned his VC. And they got all the air support they wanted that day. They were Winchestering, which means, I don't know if people know, but that means they had Apache helicopters coming in, using all their ordnance, flying back out, resupping, coming back and going again. And I think that went for 12 or 13 hours. And I think they had pretty much Apaches on call all day. And they obviously needed them because I think they were in a bit of strife to start with. But yeah, I won't talk about that action. I wasn't over the hill, but they obviously did a great job over there. What we would have given for a bit of air support the day before. Now, my take on it is, and I think it's pretty close to the money, was that the reason we didn't get air support that day was because the commanding officer of SOTG didn't allow us to have it so that it would draw some individuals that they'd been wanting to chase for quite a while, get them to come above the threshold and get on their ICOMs, so to speak, and make a play, which it worked. And, full credit to him. It was definitely a master stroke. But I have to say, we were quite angry on the first day because if we had have lost someone that day due to the fact that we weren't allowed air support, then he would have had a whole different ball game when we got back to TK.
Is that the end of the action in that battle for you?
No. So day 2, pretty heavy fighting again. I think the SASR guys got out late that afternoon and then we stayed for another 3 days, some mop-up operations. We had some small gunfights. Our team, we were on Overwatch on the last day and we were sort of on the Overwatch on one side of this big valley, watching Taliban move up the valley below us. And they were a little bit out of range for us to do anything about it. And as we were sitting there watching these guys, this is really early morning, looked over and saw this guy stand up with his AK-47 and he was on a phone or an ICOM. He was obviously trying to find us. He knew that we were there somewhere, but he couldn't see us. So we ended up taking him out. That was on the last day. And then we had a horrendous walk out to get to the helos after that. It was really, it was quite one of the toughest things I've ever done, actually. But that was 5 days of intense warfighting. By the time we got back to TK, everyone needed a bit of a rest because we pretty much hadn't slept for 5 days. It was continual work.
And at the end of that, when you finally get to sit down and breathe, how do you reflect on what's just happened, that marathon you've just endured?
It was just amazing that no one got wounded or killed, especially that first day. That first day was intense. Like when you're getting sustained, accurate fire from heavy machine guns, RPGs, all day, and there's nowhere to hide from it. You just got to sit there and take your medicine if it comes your way, was really intense, you know. That was one time I thought, okay, well, I could definitely wear around here. I can't see how we're going to get out of this without someone being killed or wounded. And I think you can say you've got good training and good drills and all that sort of stuff, but there's always a shitload of luck that comes with stuff like that as well. You know, the big sky theory, there's lots of rounds flying around and hopefully you're just not walking in front of one. When we got back to TK and we got to reflect on it, yeah, we were all really happy about it. I mean, there was already whispers going around that, you know, RS was getting a VC at that stage, and we were all sort of like, wow, that's pretty early to be talking about things like that. But then over the next couple of weeks, Task was doing some mop-up operations, doing helo ops. We were basically taking turns with our sister platoon. We'd do a day where we'd go in and do some shaping ops or clearance operations. And then we'd come back and then the other platoon would go in the next day. And we were doing that for, you know, a couple of weeks. And it was sort of towards the end of our trip. And I remember sitting down with Timmy Applin and we were having a beer one afternoon. I think we just got back from a job or something and they were going out the next day. Anyway, we're sitting at the back of our lines over there and we were having a chat. And we were just sort of like just shaking our heads and talking amongst ourselves about, man, how lucky we were to come out of Shwali Kot with nothing going on. And once again, I did this thing which I sort of, you know, kicked myself for a little bit. I sort of said to him, mate, if no one got killed there and none of us got wounded in that, no one's getting killed on this trip. Those words came out of my mouth. He laughed once again. He just laughed at me and goes, Dino, he goes, you're always saying this shit, mate. He goes, said at the selection, just kept going on. The first trip in 2009, you said it then, mate. He goes, and he was just laughing, but he was just laughing and taking the piss out of me. And I was like, yeah, true. And I apologised, almost apologised to him and said, yeah. But it's like, it's true, you know, like, how can no one get hurt after that 5 days? Well, the very next mission he went on, which was the next day, or might have even been that night, I can't remember. Yeah, they had a brownout. The helo went down and we lost Scotty Palmer, Ben Chuck and Timmy Applin that night and one of the US air crew. And all the guys on that helo were the same Sierra group that we were hanging out with at the top of the battle in the Shwali Kot. And they're like, Robbo is another great guy. He's out now. I can say his name. He's a great guy. I really look up to that guy. Such a warrior to go through what he's gone through and to be the man he is today. But he was always that man, you know, like all those guys were really badly injured. Yeah, I always regret saying that stuff. So I don't say shit like that anymore. It took a while for me to learn my lesson, but I just don't talk about stuff like that anymore because lightning does strike more than once.
Nothing you could have said, we know could have had any real impact on it, but I appreciate that is a rather unlucky curse to be carrying.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why I had a lot of survivor's guilt and a little bit of depression and stuff when I got out, because I thought about those things a lot, about what I said. And I know what you say doesn't make things happen. I understand that. But I do regret saying those couple of things because in some ruthless way, it sort of came true. The irony of it is, it did happen when you're saying it's not going to happen. So that's one of the things I think about occasionally. I might just go back quickly to helo crash. So we were woken up at about 2 a.m. and put on standby, ready to go. And all we were told was that there's been an incident. We were told that there was a brownout from one of the helicopters from the earlier sortie. There were deaths. We didn't know who at that stage, and we didn't know how many. So at that time, I sort of had a bit of a feeling in my gut, which sounds, once again, it sounds a bit, don't want it to be about me really, but I did have a bit of a feeling, and I said to my team commander at that stage, I said, do you know any names? Is it Tim? He basically sort of looked at me and he went over and he spoke to our sergeant, came back and sort of gave me a bit of a nod and said, yeah, one of them's Tim. So I actually was really devastated and distraught at that stage. I mean, nothing, I didn't show it outwardly or anything. I just know inside me, I remember that feeling going, this is really going to suck. So anyway, we got on the helos. We went out there to relieve the platoon that was involved with the crash, and they'd obviously secured the crash site and done the first sort of emu bob of picking up pieces of equipment, military equipment we don't want other people getting, weapons, and obviously, picking up pieces of people. So we relieved them in place. They left, and then our platoon did the same thing. Went out there and basically did an emu bob, kept finding pieces of equipment and so forth. And that was, to see the site was absolutely devastating, because the helo went in with such force that there were rotor blades stuck in the ground. And then 200 metres away was another piece of aircraft. 150 metres away it was spread out over a couple of football fields. Absolutely a horrendous crash that the boys were involved in. And everyone came out not unscathed by that. So we were out there for most of the day, once again, securing it, making sure no equipment was left, or no bits of, say, people and stuff were still not left on the ground. And then the SASR, I believe, came in late that afternoon and relieved us in place. And they did the same thing over the next night while there was a bit of an investigation going forth. Obviously, everyone in the unit was devastated. It was pretty heavy. We had a service for them over there. Operations pretty much, I think, kept going. I mean, we had I think there was a few down days just so we could sort of regroup and, get the unit sort of get their head around what had happened. But I'm pretty sure operations started up a few more days later and just continued on till the end of the tour. A few of us came home early to bring the bodies back. That was really towards the end of the tour. So, look, the unit just kept operating as per usual.
There's obviously the tragic loss of Tim Applin, Ben Chuck and Scott Palmer, but 7 other Aussie commandos are seriously injured, from fractures and lacerations to crush and head injuries. That's 10 people taken out of action from one level or another. So that's an effect on the unit, not just in terms of morale, but also just in terms of numbers, people on the ground.
It was actually horrific. And the other guys on the helo was a full Sierra team, sniper team. And they were one of the most experienced teams that were over there at that time. They were all very badly injured. Lots of them we're talking months, half a year to years recuperating. Some to never recuperate again fully, obviously. But a few of those guys went back to work a couple of years later, and I think 1 or 2 are still working. So that just goes to show you the calibre of guys that the unit has. And that is the amazing thing about special operations. And I think, funnily enough, those tours, obviously all those tours and the losses of guys over the years, Cam Baird, blossomed the unit from being a young unit with very little combat experience into a partner or a sister unit that rivals the SASR. It was no longer, I think, little brother. I think it was basically on even par with those guys. And, even though there's probably guys in both units that might not like me saying that or agree with it, that's fair enough. Everyone has their own opinion. But I believe after the Afghanistan conflict, I can definitely say that 2 Commando Regiment stands on its own 2 feet and is certainly not the little brother to anyone now. And I believe that's a great thing, because I know that everyone that I deal with in 2 Commando, I'll speak on my own behalf, but I have the utmost respect for the SASR Regiment and the guys that are the operators in that unit. Like, they are first class and world class, and they are second to none. But I believe, if you look at it in a macro sort of way, you look at incidents like that, and it drew everyone together and just made the unit stronger and tighter. So once we left Afghanistan and we had the ramp ceremony and we went home, we met obviously with the families and that at RAF Base Richmond. And that was a real moment for me. Well, I didn't know how to feel, actually, because I was ecstatic to be coming home because my wife had a baby 3 months prior and I hadn't, met Bub. And also then we're also bringing back, 3 really great mates and one of my best friends. And also then having to, see their families, how devastated they were at coming home. And then obviously, like you mentioned, Alex, the other 7 guys from our unit, they were all over the place. Some were in Germany and, some were sort of in Afghanistan and that's still getting treated and being repatriated at some stage. So there was 10 families there that were devastated about what had just happened. And yet, we come home and we have a bit of a ramp ceremony at the other end for the boys. And, a lot of the unit was out there to meet us. And that was a really, really hard time as well. Personally, it was for me because I went up to see Tash, which is Timmy Applin's wife. And because I'll digress a little bit, after our tours, Tim Applin and his family and me and my family, myself and my family, would take our families, like we took them on a ski holiday to New Zealand after 2009 together for a week. So we had already planned a trip to Thredbo for the whole group of us, our 2 families, at the end of this trip. I just wanted to give Tash a hug. But when we got there, it was too raw for her. She didn't want to see or talk to me at that stage, which is understandable. So we were there for a few hours. Julie decided not to bring the kids out there to meet us. because of that as well. I mean, Julie was sort of, aware that this wasn't going to be a really...
It's not the time for a happy reunion.
Correct, yeah. And you don't want to be, doing the hugging thing and all that sort of stuff when, you're wheeling in 3 coffins and there are people mourning. So I thought that was a great call. Cam Baird saw that I was pretty upset about the whole Timmy thing, and then when Tash sort of ushered me away and said, no, I can't talk to you yet, I sort of went off by myself, and Cam come over to me because of being in the team together on a previous tour and being great mates with Timmy Applin himself. And for a big unit like that to throw his arm around me and just go, mate, it's all good, let the emotions flow, blah, 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 and then, we'll get on with it. It did steady the ship for me. It wasn't for a few hours. So, that happened late afternoon on the day we got home, and it was around about maybe 11 o'clock at night, maybe even midnight before we got back to the unit. And my wife was waiting there with our bub, and there was a lot of other people waiting, like all the other spouses and family members were waiting for everyone else to come back there. So it was rather quite late at night when I first met my daughter. And that was a bittersweet moment, great to be there. We were super tired because, we'd just been working and all this sort of stuff going on and bringing the bodies home. It was a bizarre feeling.
I'll come back to your wife and meeting your daughter in a moment. Did you ever have a Christmas on deployment?
I never had a Christmas on deployment, but we did have Anzac Day.
Tell me about that.
I think it's safe to say that people knew we could get hold of some beers and some alcohol over there whenever we needed to. So it was pretty handy that we would stock a little bit up and save it for a certain few occasions when, the head shed would say, okay, boys, you can have some beers today and that sort of thing. And one of those days happened to be Anzac Day. Keith Payne came over for Anzac Day. And so there was 2 up going on and all that sort of stuff. And then we actually, because the SOTG, Special Operations Task Group, was on the other side of the HESCO barrier, so we were sort of separated from the other units in Tarankia. So we had our own little timber bar set up from all the previous tours. Guys had worked on a big wooden deck out the back, and, we had some guy there. One of the guys had a big set to play music and stuff. I'm an old guy. I'm 49. I don't even know what you'd call it, but you could do whatever you wanted to with music and play the DJ thing. And we had a big screen and stuff. So we had a very big Anzac Day there in 2010 and 2009, actually, both tours. And that was great because we all got to have a couple of days off. We were told that there's nothing going on for at least 2 or 3 days. So a day either side of it. So we actually end up paying our respects in the morning and doing the service, which was a really cool thing looking back on it, I remember actually doing the service, my first one overseas, and it really meant a lot to me to be on operations and commemorate Anzac Day. Then to finish that off with some 2 up and, having a few beers with the guys and just having a lot of fun. And we had some of the SF guys from the US base, part of the base, come over and hang out as well. And it was just a great time where everyone could sort of, for want of a better word, let their hair down, relax with each other, talk rubbish, enjoy each other's company outside of the work environment. And it got rowdy. Empty tinnies were thrown over the other side of the HESCO barrier. And I was actually awake one morning at about 2:30 or something it was. Myself and Tim and a few other guys were on the HESCO barrier finishing our last beers. And 2 gentlemen from the other side, from the normal battalion side, MTF side, came over and sort of started berating us for the empties being on their side and what were we doing drinking. And I remember Timmy Applin very politely telling them to mind their own business and finishing his beer and letting that roll down the other side as well. And so when we woke up, obviously, the next day and had breakfast and all that sort of thing, the boss came in and sort of spoke to us and said, hey, look, it's okay having a few beers out there, boys. But it was actually the commanding officer of that unit that was talking to you that morning. So whoever was telling him to piss off, we're having a few beers, can you please refrain from doing so? So, yeah, that was sort of, looking back on it, that's a very lighthearted moment. And that's, that was what it was all about, I suppose, having that little bit more free rein to have a little bit of fun when you needed to, because the amount of work that the guys were doing and the intensity of the operations of daily operations it was very important for it to be split up by having a little bit of downtime and actually having a few beers.
In your 2009 deployment, your wife very sadly had a miscarriage and you made the decision to stay in country and carry on with the mission. And I'm sure that wasn't the easiest conversation to have when you got home. This time your wife's pregnant again while you're away. Thankfully, she gives birth to a healthy baby daughter. And as you just said, you come home and meet this child for the first time. There must have been a lot of emotion going on in that moment.
Yeah, there was a lot of emotion going on when I came home and met Jace, my little girl. Obviously had some photos sent over when we were in country and that sort of thing. And that's all very well and good. But Alex, after she lost a bub and then come home after that tour and then we go away again and you know, and then she gives birth. For her to do that by herself, having 2 little boys already, young kids already, and then give birth while I'm away, you know, is a fantastic, I was going to say achievement, but it just shows you the calibre of lady that she is, you know. To be able to handle that, I can't imagine how hard that would have been on her. And coming home and meeting Bub that night, it was really good. I mean, you know, we sat down at the servicemen's club that we were at on base, and, you know, everyone was sort of saying good day. And it was nice to have Bub there, and I held her for the first time and all that sort of thing. But it was also really bizarre because obviously, like I just said, everyone was really on a bit of a downer, obviously, because of what we'd just been through, you know. Like right towards the end of the tour, we lose 3 guys, 7 guys are really badly injured, and the air crew, the other, you know, 4 members of the air crew, one of those guys died and the other 3 were badly injured as well. So it was a real morbid way, I suppose, to celebrate seeing your daughter for the first time. Even in that moment, it reiterated to me on how lucky I was. And I had this thing, someone's always having a worse day than you. All that was in my mind was, you know, like, how were the other families and spouses feeling about their loved ones that they'd lost? And I had that same moment when we landed out at the crash site and we started looking around for gear and stuff like that. And in my head, I was just like, I was devastated that I knew that Tim was gone. And it didn't take me long to realise that I was sort of just spiralling down into a little bit of, not depression, but just being sad and not focusing on the job. I remember thinking, I'm feeling sad. I'm so sad. I've lost my friend, you know, how devastating is this? And then it was like a bolt of lightning, you know, and it struck me and it was like, well, if I'm feeling this bad, you know, bad as Ben Chuck, Scotty Palmers and, you know, Tash Applin, how are they going to feel when they hear this news? You know, like, someone is always having a worse day than you, no matter what's going on in your life. There are worse things that can happen. Keep everything in perspective and soldier on, chin up and keep moving forward.
What's really impressive to me, Dean, is that you had such significant injuries when you were younger, yet here you are at this point in time in your late 30s doing special forces operations in Afghanistan 2 years in a row, from Qantas flight attendant to commando. It's a really impressive turnaround. But did those old injuries ever catch up with you?
They surfaced a couple of times, but the main one, I suppose, was on one of those operations that we were doing, the helo ops, towards the end of that trip. I just jumped out. It was really innocuous, actually. I just jumped out of a helo. There was sort of, I don't know, knee-high grass wherever we were getting out in the greenbelt this time. And I just stepped off and then down, and there was obviously a big hole or a ditch that I'd actually just stepped into, not expecting it. I've gone another half a metre or metre further forward with all your gear on, and it really just, it banged in, jarred my back straight away, and I sort of hadn't had that for a long time. I hadn't felt it like that for a long time because I'd worked very hard to be fit and healthy and strong again. When that happened, I knew straight away that it was something pretty serious. I went back and went to the RAP, went to see the med officer and that sort of stuff. And, you know, for those last sort of week or two, I chewed a lot of painkillers and stuff like that and anti-inflammatories just to finish the job, because at that stage, we had, our team was down to 4 people from all the injuries and the deaths that we'd had. All the teams were manned pretty lightly at that time. So I just wanted to finish the trip and not leave my team from a 6-man team to a 4. If I had left, it would have been down to 3. So I just didn't want to leave in the lurch. So I did everything I could, and the medical officer at the time really looked after me with that. And it was fortunate enough that I saw the rest of the trip through. And the unfortunate part of it is that it was a shorter time period than I needed to, because of, once the Black Hawk accident happened, then the trip got cut shorter again. So once I got home and started to get some real medical attention and advice around that, was the catalyst for me getting out of the military, because my back was absolutely buggered this time. And then obviously I had a few issues with survivor guilt and some depression, which flowed on from going on leave when I got home. And my wife and I we still went and had that week down at Thredbo. And it wasn't a great week, to be quite honest, because 1, we weren't there with the people we wanted to be there with. 2, we had a newborn baby. And 3, I was sort of starting to, you know, have really early signs of not having the right mechanisms in place for coping with a little bit of survival guilt. I came home and I stayed home. Basically didn't go back to the unit. A hard thing for me to do, actually. I didn't want to go back there and face the guys, to be quite honest. It was a very, very tough time for me. And I don't mean to sound like I'm just talking about me all the time. I was thinking about the guys and that as well. Like, you know, I didn't want to go back there and be that guy walking around the unit that has a crook back and has a few issues upstairs as well. And I think this is really early on in the piece. You know, we've seen over the years now about how many guys, even just from our unit alone, let alone the Greater Army, have committed suicide and things like that from PTSD and depression. I don't think I was ever in that headspace, that heavy. But I certainly didn't want to be walking around the unit and, I suppose, inflicting my sort of depression and stuff like that on the other guys. So
You didn't want to be a burden either. Not that you would have been, but this is the mindset you had.
correct, yes. And I have to say, the unit was amazing. I had phone calls from the commanding officer, from previous commanding officers that I knew. From my OC actually flew up to Queensland and came out to our house, but I was actually at Inogra at the hospital the day he came out, and he actually sat down with my wife for a few hours and said, look, everything's fine. Dean's got a great reputation amongst the guys in the unit, blah, 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 and all this sort of stuff, which is really cool. It's amazing. My mates never stopped calling me and texting me and ringing and that sort of thing. I end up having a full back operation. I've got a thing that's called a cage in the back there. So it's about 2 or 3 inches long and a few bolts and all sorts of things going on there. I've had 4 knee operations. And so I've been put back together relatively well. But through that time, I self-medicated as well as taking the medication that the guys were giving us. Had a few little stints in a hospital for my headspace. And that alone was challenging. And even in there, I have to say, I made wrong choices, like I was self-medicating in there as well. It was a really, I don't want to say tough time. It was a time in my life. I've never been like that before. And I haven't been like that since either. But it was just a very bizarre time. I didn't want to reach out to anyone, didn't want to be a burden to anyone, even including my wife and my kids. The yin and the yang of it was that I was at home and, I'd take my kids surfing across the road and teach my young boys how to surf and that sort of stuff. I still had a lot of processing of different thoughts to go through. That took me quite a while.
And after you discharged, Dean, that's not the end of it for you either, because it's after that Mervyn McDonald and Cameron Baird, close mates of yours in the unit and who you're on tour with in 2009, are killed.
Yes. So obviously the unit still had another couple of years in the conflict in Afghanistan, and that was one of the reasons that I was really upset with myself actually at the time, because it was a job that wasn't finished and I really didn't want to leave my mates in the unit doing the same thing when the job wasn't finished, when the war wasn't over. So having said that, at different times I received the news of different guys in the unit dying, some that I knew really well and some that I didn't know as well, I'd met or spent some time with. Brett Wood was another guy who I really looked up to. The news of Merv getting killed in another Black Hawk crash and then Cameron Baird dying in action was absolutely devastating. I had my good friends ring me up, another guy who's out, but I don't want to mention his name because he's still working overseas and stuff. But he would contact me and out of the blue, some of the times he'd just ring me up, hey, mate, here you go on Parker, and we just talk rubbish. And then those couple of times he was the one that would call me up and say, hey, mate, got something to tell you. And when he told me about Merv passing away, I was absolutely shattered once again, I suppose I had the luxury of being at home and not having to still be on operations and still doing stuff. But I have to say, being at that stage, I had really separated myself from the unit, not in touch with anyone from the unit. So I dealt with a lot of these things by myself once again, instead of being around the guys and some really close mates who understand exactly what's going on when something like that happens, I would just deal with it myself. And that would be, moping around the yard or going across the beach and just thinking about things, and really hit home strong when we'd lost, obviously, Tim, then Merv, and then Cameron. And that's 3 guys out of my team in 2009. So that's the Legends car photo that everyone goes on about. We took photos of each car then, and how bizarre is it? Those 3 guys, 3 really good guys, have all gone in different times during that conflict. It's easy to say they're all good guys, but I have to say, it just seems to be that the good do die young. And I'm talking about guys with integrity and good work ethic and funny, smart, just guys you'd want to hang around with, and certainly guys you want to be in a hole with or jump out of a helo with on an operation and those types of environments. They are the exact guys who you want to be with. To have those 3 guys immortalised in that picture, I think is just an amazing thing for not only the unit, but for the country. Wherever you see that picture, it's been painted, and I think there's one in the War Memorial. If there's not, there will be soon, in Cam's book and that sort of thing. To actually see that picture now and remember being there that day that we took those photos, and we're all just mucking around smiling, and Cam was saying, come on wankers, hurry up, take these photos so we get on with it, some real soldiering rather than just sitting around taking photos and stuff like that. To remember that 5 minutes, that process, and then to see them immortalised in that photo and they're all smiling and they're all just happy, I think it's a special thing. It's a special part of Australian history.
You had wanted to be in this position, a Special Forces soldier, for the longest time, and we've obviously touched on some of the hardships and challenges you've dealt with. We also touched on some of the great moments you had on deployment and how satisfying it was for you to be there and finally test these skills of yours. If you could go back in time, would you do it all again? And what are some of the positives you've taken away from your military service?
I would absolutely do it all again. In a heartbeat, I'd go back now. I mean, I'm 49 years old, and this is how ridiculously stupid some of the things that go around my head are. With all the stuff that's going on in the world right now, I got onto the website the other day as a young guy here. He's 26. He wants to join the 2nd Commando Regiment. I think he'd be great for it. So we were doing some research for him and sort of sorting it out, and I've put him in touch with some of the guys at the unit and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm looking on there, and at the moment, it's probably just, the PC thing, but it says the top age bracket for joining Special Forces is 50. And I was just joking around with my wife the other day and said, see, I've still got another 12 months. I could go back.
And how did she react to that?
She was like, yeah, that's not happening. It's not happening at all. And I tell you, mate, I'd go back in a heartbeat. And regrets, I have none at all. I think the only regret, I wish that this had have happened to me when I was 22 instead of when I was 37. I really wish I had a lot more time in the unit with those guys. I have the utmost respect for everyone in the military. It doesn't matter what branch you're in. Everyone's got a job to do, and it's such an important role in everyone's life. It's the cliche thing to say that everyone takes things for granted in this country, and they do. And I've had people ask me questions about, certain questions about, the military and what's it like, and, that war, is it just? And if the kids don't want to get out of bed, like my kids don't want to get out of bed and show, not my kids, but someone else's kids don't want to get out of bed on Anzac morning and show respect. What do you think? Can you just tell them, something about it so they want to get out of bed? And I continually tell people the same thing. And it's like, well, if they want to sleep in, let them sleep in, because, I mean, that's why guys are on the wall. That's why guys go away, and that's why soldiers, such as the guys we've been talking about, guys in these units, go away and implement this country's foreign policies in other parts of the world and go away and help people so that you can have freedom of choice in Australia. The choice to not get out of bed and sleep in on that day. I mean, I'm okay with that. Obviously, I'd like everyone to get up and pay respects, but to actually have the choice and not be told you have to do things, that is why guys and girls join the military in the first place, so that we have those abilities to make those decisions for ourselves and not have something shoved down our throat. So I know I'm digressing off the subject a little bit, but I would, in a heartbeat, go back, do it all over again and not change a thing. And I just love the unit itself. The 2nd Commando Regiment, the guys that gave me a chance, from recruiting through to the guys that put me in their team, to the guys that I served alongside. They're just some of the most amazing people that this country produces. And you say the same thing for the SASR as well. I look back on it very fondly. With everything that's happened, I wouldn't change a thing, mate.
Well, Dean, you mentioned earlier that you had, for a time, separated yourself a bit from the regiment and were in touch with a few guys, but obviously lots changed over the years. You've moved on with life. You very generously put your hand up to say, hey, you'll come on the podcast and share some stories. So I want to know, Dean, how are you and the family doing today? What have you been doing with yourself since leaving the army? And I guess, why did you volunteer to come on the show?
The reason I volunteered to come on the show is because it's very cathartic for me, because I haven't really spoken a lot about any of this to anyone. A little bit to my wife, nothing really to the kids. Both my boys have read Cameron Baird's book, because I believe that's very recent history that everyone in Australia needs to know about. But I don't throw and shove anything down their throats all the time like that. But as you know, I put it off a few times, and I was even going to put it off again, because I just didn't feel comfortable talking about me, because as I said to you earlier, mate, like, I've never looked at myself as being a super soldier or anything like that. I mean, I'm far from it, I think I just wanted to contribute, and I wanted to contribute at the highest level. And I just didn't want to be, I was a grunt, so I'm allowed to say this, I believe, I just didn't want to just be in a battalion. There's nothing wrong with that, obviously, but I wanted to do soldiering at the highest level I could. In regards to, what we're doing now, like, the family's, really going along swimmingly. We live up here on the Sunshine Coast, not far from the beach. Both my boys are exceptional surfers and exceptional snowboarders. One of them has a scholarship with the NSWIS, New South Wales Institute of Sport, and is on the sort of the Youth Olympic Winter Sports program, trying to go to the Olympics for snowboarding. My little girl is a lot like me. She hates school. She's very outdoorsy, loves horses, and she's just a ratbag who is just an incredible little, light in our lives. My wife is still working for Civil Aviation Safety Authority. She's been there for many years and, she's charging along. We're very happy, mate. You know, we have our ups and downs like any family, but I think overall, for two young men that sort of grew up with their mother, just looking after them for, you know, a good 5 to 7 year period there when they were really young. For me, it's all about putting more time in with the kids and the family. You know, you can't catch time up, you know, and it's not about quality time, so to speak. It's just about good time with the kids as much as I can. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm Mr. Mumming at the moment. I spend a lot of time at the moment away with my son with his snowboarding. I follow him around, make sure he's doing his schoolwork, make sure he's eating well, make sure he's training hard, and he hears all sorts of, you know, sayings and all sorts of stuff that I've learned over the years coming out of my mouth, throwing it down range at him and that sort of thing. And I just enjoy being a father at the moment. I'm very blessed to have 3 really good kids. They're all different. The oldest fellow, Jai, he's finishing year 12 this year. You know, he does the physics, chemistry, all that sort of stuff. He's just a straight A kid and he loves the environment. So he's a bit of an environmental warrior. So they're all very different, mate, and I'm very proud of all the 3 of them and who they are becoming. You know, the 2 young lads are becoming great young men, and that's what we need in this country. We need good young people that can have different opinions and varying different looks on life, but still listen intently to someone else's opinion and not get upset by it. We're in a happy spot. We're just chugging along like any other family in Australia.
Well, Dean, I don't think you give yourself enough credit. You've had a lot of experience in the military over years. And I know from a few SASR guys, for example, they say that sort of the optimal age to actually attempt selection is often in late 20s, not earlier when you might be a bit younger or a bit fitter or something. But the late 20s you've got the maturity and the life experience, and that's a quality needed at that higher level of operation. And you were a bit above that range when you finally got into commandos, but you still would have brought some perspective, some real life experience and military experience to the equation there, which I'm sure was valued in the field. You played your part like many others. You've seen some really significant engagements and you've worked with some absolute legends in the community. So I'm glad that you've come forward to share your story because it's got a lot of different color to it, a lot of character. You've been through a lot, your family's been through a lot, and you're still there going strong. And I think that's really admirable. And people can take a lot of lessons of resilience and hard work ethic from you.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say, Alex. And I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me, mate, and letting me, you know, share a little bit of my story with you and whoever's going to listen to it. I really appreciate it.
Dean Parkinson, thank you for your service and for your time today. More of that track in just a moment. My thanks to Dean for coming on the show. For more on Cameron Baird and his passing, listen to the Season 2 bonus episode, The Commando's Father, with Doug Baird.
So the doorbell rang that particular night. Kay answered the door and there was 3 soldiers there with their hats in their hand, and she knew, just like I did, that he'd been killed.
And for more on the late Mervyn MacDonald, listen to number 77, Adrian Humphreys, Volume 1.
Still thought, oh, fuck, I've been shot. Can't do my job. I really hope I'm not paralysed. I'm still alive. All these little very clear moments of clarity that you have in your head.
And Volume 2.
The body bags, they're on the stretchers being extracted up to this helicopter. Looking at the bags, they'd obviously been crushed underneath the aircraft.
For another perspective on the tragic helicopter crash, listen to number 54, H Volume 5.
But the suffering and the extent of injuries that the remainder of the boys had that lived in that crash, it was just fucking horrific.
To see photos of our guests in action, check us out on social media. We're at Life on the Line Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at LOTL Pod on Twitter. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design. Theme music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Closing music, War, by John Lynham. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget.
Confusion was burning to his eyes. From that day he kissed his mother goodbye. He knew it was no game, and when he landed there, he never felt so much fear in the air. He didn't sleep that first night, Now nothing seemed to change. 9 years on, it gets dark and it's the same. Fear burned in his eyes, and the scars left in his mind. They start to ease the more he drinks his homemade wine. He's standing at the bar with his back against the wall. This bloke told me he was back from the Afghan war. He's just another Aussie boy who's been to war.